12. Nancy Gonzalez. While working third shift at a federal prison in New York City in 2012, corrections officer Nancy Gonzalez began a hot and heavy affair with convicted death row comp killer Ronell Wilson. The pair snuck off to a nearby activity room for late-night action multiple times over a several-month period before informants reported the illicit relationship to authorities. According to jailhouse snitches, Gonzalez concocted a scheme to get pregnant by Wilson in hopes that becoming a father would garner enough sympathy to get him off death row. And her timing couldn't have been better, because when the pair conceived, Wilson was facing a new sentencing hearing amid a years-long court battle to spare his life. The fling ended when Wilson was moved to solitary confinement without explanation. In a recorded conversation with her new boyfriend, who was also incarcerated, Gonzalez admitted that Wilson was the father of her baby. Under the law, prisoners are considered incapable of consenting to physical relations. But Gonzalez depicted herself as the real victim, saying she got sucked into Wilson's world and describing herself as vulnerable and wanting to be loved. However, during questioning, she reportedly confessed to getting pregnant on purpose. Authorities charged Gonzalez with abusing a person in custody, and shortly after giving birth to a son, she lost parental rights for driving drunk with the baby in the car. During her court proceedings, her lawyer blamed trauma for Gonzalez's poor decisions, which included intimate encounters with at least 8 fellow guards during the last 2 years she worked at the prison. Meanwhile, the disgraced former corrections officer's last-ditch effort to spare Wilson's life failed, and he was sentenced to death for a second time in his resentencing hearing. Gonzalez pleaded guilty and was sentenced to a year and 1 day in federal prison. And just weeks after Gonzalez's arrest, another corrections officer from New York State made news headlines for shockingly similar reasons. 39-year-old Taishinia Love Brewster was reportedly 6 months pregnant by an inmate at a state correctional facility when she got busted for the forbidden tryst. The prisoner was relocated and Brewster lost her job and faced criminal charges, but unfortunately, the outcome of the case is unclear. 11. Jesse Dobbs. During the pre-dawn hours one day in November 2016, a Baytown, Texas resident overheard gunshots but didn't call the police. Several hours later, officers performed a welfare check at the home of 37-year-old Cynthia Morris at the request of her concerned co-workers. When they entered the house, they found Morris and one of her daughters, Brianna Pavlicek, dead with gunshot wounds in the master bedroom. Law enforcement issued an alert for Morris's other daughter, Kirsten Fritsch, who'd vanished with her boyfriend, 21-year-old Jesse Dobbs, in the family's car. Someone spotted the couple that morning, but investigators failed to catch up with them until hours later, when the mother of Dobbs' children told authorities that Dobbs had called her and asked to see his kids. Police traced the phone number to a Texas City nightclub called Shenanigans, where they found the young man wet and shoeless. They picked him up on a resisting arrest charge and questioned him on Kirsten's whereabouts. Dobbs reportedly confessed to killing his girlfriend, stating that he killed not the real Kirsten, but the fake Kirsten. He then refused to disclose the location of her body. Kirsten's remains were found behind Shenanigans following a 2-day search. She'd been stabbed more than 50 times in the face, neck, and torso, and was also covered in defensive wounds, showing just how hard she fought for her life during her final moments. Authorities charged Dobbs with Kirsten's murder. He pleaded guilty but argued in court that he acted with sudden passion. Under Texas law, this means that a crime was committed in the heat of the moment, and that the killer didn't plan the crime but acted out of sudden emotion. The jury rejected Dobbs' sudden passion claim though, and they sentenced him to 45 years in prison. He's required to serve at least half his sentence before becoming eligible for parole. Dobbs was never charged with the murders of Kirsten's mum and sister, but he remains the prime suspect in the case. 10. Craig Becker. Joanna Hove Becker moved from Sweden to the United States with her parents in 1999 at the age of 6 and grew up to become a psychologist and military wife. In 2013, she moved to Mons, Belgium with her husband, Navy Lieutenant Craig Becker, who was assigned to a NATO post in the country. The couple then went on to have a daughter the following year. In October 2015, police responded to reports of a woman falling or jumping out of a 7th-story window at the Becker's apartment building, and they arrived to find 32-year-old Joanna lying dead on the pavement in a pool of her own blood. Craig told investigators that his wife struggled deeply with addiction and mental illness. Authorities initially ruled that she'd taken her own life, but they reclassified her death as a homicide after an autopsy found high levels of drugs in her system that would have rendered her unconscious. With the amount of medication in Joanna's body, she wouldn't have been able to climb out the window, much less stand up on her own. And a closer look at her injuries and other evidence further pointed toward foul play. Joanna's family insisted that she'd have never willingly abandoned her daughter, and her friends didn't notice anything unusual about her behavior, although like any other person she had some problems in her life. Her marriage to Craig had deteriorated after their daughter's birth, and the couple had separated about a month before Joanna's death. 2 years earlier, she'd accused Craig of hitting and choking her after finding a text message from another man in her phone. But she recanted her criminal complaint against him and the case was dropped. Joanna's friends and family later told police that she feared what Craig might do to her if his career were damaged. After Joanna's death, authorities arrested Craig on suspicion of murder. He languished in Belgian custody for the next 2 years until the US Navy finally became willing to prosecute the case. Craig adamantly maintained his innocence and seemed eager to get the court proceedings over with so he could clear his name and go back to living a normal life, but that never happened. According to court documents, he became enraged after learning that Joanna was seeing a new boyfriend. At the time, she'd just paid a deposit on her own place and was about to move out of the home she and Craig shared. Shortly after discovering Joanna's new relationship, Craig drugged her wine with a powerful cocktail of sedatives and painkillers, including a surgical-grade anesthesia drug called midazolam. After rendering his estranged wife unconscious, he sent her plummeting to the pavement 7 stories below. Craig was also accused of impersonating Joanna by using her phone to send text messages to himself, making it appear as though she was interested in reconciling. Craig didn't erupt into the type of frenzied rage typically associated with a crime of passion. In fact, it was evident that he planned the murder. However, he acted on short notice after slowly boiling over with fury toward Joanna and reaching a point of no return with his anger. In the end, he was found guilty of assault, conduct unbecoming of an officer and a gentleman, and murder. And as a result, the court sentenced Craig Becker to life in prison without parole. 9. Taikwan Long. 36-year-old New York City resident Joan Gravett was shot multiple times in broad daylight and was left for dead in 2016 at the hands of her jealous ex-boyfriend 29-year-old Taikwan Long. The fatal shooting happened in the hallway of Gravett's apartment building in Far Rockaway, Queens. Taikwan went on the deadly rampage after becoming suspicious that the victim had cheated on him with her neighbor. The relationship had recently ended, and Joanne had obtained a restraining order against Taikwan, but a piece of paper wasn't enough to keep him away. After gunning Joanne down in cold blood, Taikwan continued to pull the trigger repeatedly as he followed Barbara Romano, the mother of the man he thought Joanne was cheating with, into the building's lobby. Barbara was shot in the hand as she ducked for cover behind a security desk and crawled to a nearby boiler room where she dialed 911. Luckily, she survived her injuries. Joanne's neighbors and relatives described the victim's 5-year relationship with Taikwan as rocky. They said Taikwan had a history of being violent and threatening toward Joanne, and that his anger issues had recently worsened due to his drug use. And just a few months before Joanne's murder, he was charged with assault for allegedly throwing a shoe at her and hitting her with a lamp. On the day of the shooting, Taikwan called Joanne's neighbor Johnny Kelly, the man he thought she was cheating with, and left multiple threatening voicemails stating that there would be bloodshed if Johnny didn't give him money. He also allegedly charged Johnny in a subway station with a crazed look in his eyes just minutes before he opened fire on Joanne. Johnny later told the New York Times that he begged Joanne to come into his apartment where she could be safe from Taikwan, but she didn't seem to think she was in serious danger and insisted on staying at home. The scorned shooter fled the crime scene and remained on the run for over a month before being captured in Sacramento. He was then extradited to New York on suspicion of murder, attempted murder, and other charges. And in the end, a jury convicted Taikwan of all counts, and he was sentenced to 45 years to life in prison. 8. Nicholas Holbert. While stationed at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, 23-year-old U.S. Army medic Kelly Bordeaux became a regular at a bar called Froggy Bottoms in North Fayetteville. On what began as a typical Friday night in April 2012, she headed to her watering hole, ready to cut loose after a long and stressful work week. Kelly didn't drink enough to get drunk, but she made sure she had a designated driver anyway. But shortly after midnight, she left Froggy Bottoms with her DD, Nicholas Holbert, and was never seen or heard from again. In Kelly's mind, she and Nicholas were platonic friends. She thought of him as a drinking buddy, and nothing more. And with an estranged husband she was thinking about divorcing and a new long-distance boyfriend named Justin Thompson in the picture, her plate was full as far as relationships went. At the time, Thompson was living in Florida. He'd met Nicholas Holbert during a previous visit to see Kelly and had gotten creepy vibes from him. Thompson was upset when he learned that Kelly was relying on Holbert for a ride home, not because he thought she might cheat, but because he was worried for her safety. Helpless to protect Kelly from hundreds of miles away, Thompson urged her to take pepper spray, but unfortunately she brushed off his concerns. Holbert was a drifter who worked at the bar part-time and lived in the forest behind it. Following Kelly's disappearance, he told police he dropped her off outside her apartment and had no idea where she went after that. Law enforcement didn't believe him, but they didn't have enough evidence to arrest him, especially since Kelly was merely a missing person at that point and it was unclear whether any crimes had been committed. Holbert maintained his innocence and acted worried about his missing friend. He assisted in a search for Kelly, which failed to turn up any sign of her, and even went on the news and pleaded with the public for information regarding her whereabouts. Kelly remained missing for the next 2 years, while a determined private investigator named David Marshburn turned it into his new full-time job to befriend Holbert and get him to talk. In the beginning, Marshburn focused on gaining Holbert's trust and even helped him out financially. Later on in his mission, Marshburn claimed to have police connections and said he could get Holbert a cushy plea deal, even though it wasn't true. All Holbert had to do in exchange for a promised slap on the wrist was divulge the details of what happened to Kelly and where her body was. Holbert initially took the bait, but then he got nervous and backed down to the 11th hour. So, in a last-ditch attempt to get him back on the hook, Marshburn told him he was about to be indicted for murder, which once again wasn't true. This revelation quickly got Holbert back on board with the phony plea offer and led Marshburn to Kelly's shallow grave, which wasn't far from the campsite where he lived. And in a chilling confession, Holbert admitted to killing Kelly in a jealous rage after realizing that she only saw him as a friend. As he watched her act kindly with other guys at the bar while paying little attention to him, Holbert became consumed with anger, but maintained his composure for the time being. But at some point during the night, someone warned Kelly that Holbert had prior convictions for assaulting women. She then refused to get in Holbert's vehicle after leaving the bar, so he attacked her and knocked her unconscious. And when Kelly woke up to Holbert on top of her and tried to fight him off, he bludgeoned her repeatedly in the head with a rock. He then buried Kelly's body and went back to the bar to continue drinking. After realizing he'd been duped into confessing, Holbert pleaded guilty to first-degree murder and was sentenced to life without parole. 7. Oscar Solas. While finishing his shift in Pasco County, Florida one night in April 2023, 59-year-old Uber Eats driver Randall Cook pulled over to text his wife and let her know that he'd be home soon. But he went radio silent and never came home, causing his wife to grow increasingly worried as her text messages went unanswered. After waiting several hours, she reported Cook missing to the police. Officers then obtained Cook's last known location from Uber Eats and visited the address. Surveillance footage provided by a household member at the residence showed Cook approaching the house with a delivery around the time of his disappearance. But the clip suddenly cut out right after he reached the door, at which point investigators believe Cook was yanked inside the home. Video from the next day appeared to show two people, including a man later identified as 30-year-old Oscar Solas, placing multiple garbage bags and a cooler alongside the home. And when officers looked inside the bags, they found the missing driver's dismembered remains. They also recovered Cook's wedding ring and car keys from inside the home. Solas has known ties to a faction of the notorious MS-13 gang in Indiana, as well as an extensive criminal record filled with violent convictions for past offenses. He'd recently moved to the Sunshine State after being released from prison. The 315-pound parolee, whose face is almost entirely covered in tattoos, worked as a bouncer at a strip club. Police took Solas into custody for failing to register as a felon in Pasco County and later charged him with first-degree murder and abuse of a corpse. At the moment, he's being held without bail while the case proceeds in court. Describing Cook's murder as demonic and a horrific crime of passion, Pasco Sheriff Chris Nocco said that law enforcement was working diligently to identify any connections between Solas and the victim. As things currently stand, it appears as though the murder was random, and the Cook unknowingly entered the path of a raging psychopath whose actions cannot be understood by any sane person or anyone with a shred of conscience. About a month after the gruesome slaying, prosecutors announced plans to pursue the death penalty against Solas, citing the particularly horrifying and cruel nature of the unprovoked crime. 6. Brenda Lazaro. Late one night in early February 2014, police in Coppell, Texas received a 911 call from a hysterical woman who claimed that her boyfriend had shot himself in his apartment. Officers arrived to find 27-year-old Jonathan Cruz dead from a single gunshot wound to the head. The victim's girlfriend of 3 months, Brenda Lazaro, claimed that the injury was self-inflicted. Jonathan's family immediately suspected Brenda of lying. Although Jonathan had a history of depression, he hadn't shown any recent signs of being in a potentially harmful state of mind. For the most part, he seemed happy about how things were going and excited about his future. In fact, according to some of his friends and relatives, the only major problem in Jonathan's life was his relationship with Brenda. On several occasions, those closest to him had noticed troubling signs of possible jealousy and possessiveness. Speaking with Dateline in 2023, Jonathan's mother said that she had to tell her son to put his phone down during a family vacation. At the time, he'd just started dating Brenda, and they were already texting constantly. This could be a perfectly normal example of a new couple caught up in their excitement for each other, but in hindsight, it seemed like one of many red flags symbolizing an unhealthy attachment between the pair. During a double date one evening, Brenda allegedly became infuriated with Jonathan for giving his friend's wife Emily a friendly hug. Her anger over Jonathan and Emily's platonic friendship only grew with time, according to Jonathan's sister Danny Cruz, who told Dateline that her brother ended the relationship over Brenda's controlling ways the day before his death. The family's suspicions were heightened when Brenda failed to attend Jonathan's funeral. To this day, they believe that Jonathan broke up with Brenda and that she showed up at his apartment to try persuading him to continue the relationship. According to their theory, an argument broke out and Brenda shot Jonathan in a fit of anger when she didn't get her way. Brenda maintained her innocence and claimed she was a welcome guest at Jonathan's apartment. She was never arrested or charged in connection with the case, and Jonathan's manner of death remains undetermined. Some investigators allege that the forensics can't rule out an accident or self-inflicted wound, while others claim that based on the evidence, it would have been impossible for Jonathan to be responsible for what happened to him. His family spent years urging the authorities to continue treating the incident as a possible homicide, but they chose not to. The case is inactive and, for all intents and purposes, classified as an unfortunate tragedy. In the absence of a criminal case against Brenda, the Cruz family pursued justice in civil court via a wrongful death lawsuit, which went to trial in 2022. A jury awarded them $206 million in damages, which they know they'll likely never see, but they made it clear long ago that the principle of the matter is more important than the money. Brenda has since gone married and is now a mother of two. And while she's innocent in the eyes of the law, some people remain convinced that she got away with murder. 5. Gibson Pool. Breakups are understandably upsetting, but 29-year-old Gibson Pool took his reaction to a whole new level on Valentine's Day in 2011 after learning that his girlfriend, Tomika Peterson, was planning to leave him. Tomika was going to change the locks on her home in Riviera Beach, Florida, but never got the chance before Gibson uncovered her plan. As she tried to leave the residence with some friends, Gibson approached her car and repeatedly asked Tomika if she was leaving him. When she didn't answer to his satisfaction, he opened fire on the vehicle, striking Tomika and one of her friends. Another friend jumped into the driver's seat and rushed to the nearest hospital, but sadly, Tomika died from her injuries. Gibson then fled the state and immediately became the subject of a federal manhunt. After allegedly threatening to kill any cop who tried to arrest him and saying that he'd not be taken alive, authorities were especially determined to capture him before he could harm anyone else. Fortunately, Gibson made it easy for law enforcement to locate him by leaving his cell phone on while in hiding. Police tracked him to a motel 800 miles from the crime scene in Kingsport, Tennessee, where his van was found sitting right outside the building. He was taken into custody without incident and was charged with first-degree murder, aggravated assault, shooting into an occupied vehicle, and being a felon in possession of a firearm. And in the end, Gibson was sentenced on all counts and was sentenced to life in prison. 4. Michael Pagel. Most people who knew 41-year-old Renee Pagel thought of her as one of the kindest people they'd ever met. Known for her giving nature, the recently divorced mother of three from Rockford, Michigan even donated her kidney to the father of one of her nursing students, a man she barely knew in 2006. But no human being is universally liked, and Renee was no exception. Just days after the kidney operation, Renee's parents found her dead in her bedroom. They quickly realized that there was too much blood, and her injuries were too severe for her death to be the result of post-surgery complications. Someone had stabbed Renee dozens of times in the face, head, and torso in an apparent rage before fleeing the scene with the murder weapon. Several persons of interest were quickly ruled out, including Renee's brother-in-law Charles Pagel and a tenant who rented an apartment above her horse barn. Authorities soon turned their attention toward her ex-husband Michael Pagel, who'd recently come out on the losing end of an acrimonious divorce. During the couple's marriage, Renee was the breadwinner and Michael was a stay-at-home dad. When the pair split, Michael expected to win primary custody of the kids and to receive alimony payments. He also wanted the house. But in the eyes of the judge, there was no reason for Michael not to get a job. So he awarded the house and primary custody of the kids to Renee and ordered Michael to pay alimony. Michael was enraged by the ruling, which came just weeks before Renee's murder. He certainly had a motive to kill his ex-wife, and he acted suspicious right off the bat by refusing to speak to detectives and referring them to his lawyer. Investigators lacked enough evidence to charge him with the crime, and the case remained unsolved for the next 13 years. A break finally came in 2019 though, when Michael's brother Charles contacted Renee's friend Chris Crandall, who was leading a renewed effort to gather information on the case. He said that the people who suspected Michael of killing Renee were right about what kind of person he was. Without going into much detail, Charles claimed that his brother had gone crazy and expressed fear that he'd be the next victim. But when Crandall pushed him for details about the murder, he claimed he didn't know anything. Charles eventually told police 5 years after Renee's death that Michael had shown him the murder weapon and had said he'd used it to finalize his divorce in 2011. He threw the blade into a nearby river, where it remained until Charles revealed its location to investigators. When asked why he didn't come forward earlier, he claimed that Michael had threatened to kill him if he told anyone what he knew. Armed with new evidence, prosecutors were finally able to charge Michael in 2020. And after realizing how high the deck was stacked against him, he pleaded guilty to second-degree murder in exchange for a 25 to 50-year sentence. He apologized for his actions in court, yet he passed the buck by accusing Charles of helping to plot the crime and of being the actual killer. But authorities never found any evidence to suggest that this was the case. They continue to believe that Michael acted alone in a fit of rage when he could no longer contain his anger at Renee over the outcome of the divorce. 3. John Hamilton. 52-year-old John Hamilton was a well-known doctor in Oklahoma City with a reputation for being calm and mild-mannered. He was also romantic and generous, perhaps to a fault, and showed his love for his wife Susan by spoiling her with expensive gifts and vacations. The couple tied the knot in 1987 and were married for 14 years. And from the outside looking in, they seemed to have the kind of relationship most people hope for. That all changed though on Valentine's Day in 2001, when John dialed 911 and reported that he'd discovered Susan dead in a pool of blood when he stomped home during a work break. Susan had been strangled with 2 neckties and bludgeoned in the head with such force that her brain matter was exposed. John was hysterical and covered in blood when police arrived. He seemed genuinely distraught, but his story didn't add up. He said he'd tried performing mouth-to-mouth on Susan, but there was no blood on his face. He suggested that Susan had been targeted by anti-abortion activists who were known to picket outside his office, but it seemed unlikely to investigators. There were no signs of forced entry, and nothing appeared to be stolen. Detectives also noticed a distinct lack of bloody footprints, which was unusual given Susan's manner of death. While processing the scene, police found the Valentine's Day card that Susan had given John that day. The note written inside hinted toward problems in the marriage, stating, "I bought this 2 weeks ago, so I guess maybe it doesn't seem as appropriate, but I do love you. Have a good day, Susan." According to a friend, Susan had recently discovered some suspicious calls John had made to a stripper. John tried claiming that the young woman was just a patient who'd reached out to him personally for help. But Susan didn't buy it, and she believed John was having an affair. The couple had also recently argued over money. While en route to the police station for questioning, officers noticed that John was rubbing his hands against the squad car's mesh divider, leading them to wonder if he was trying to conceal injuries he'd sustained while attacking his wife. An overview of his movements revealed that he was late for his second scheduled operation of the day, creating a big enough window of time for him to have committed the crime. Authorities charged John with Susan's murder, but he received widespread public support even as the dirty laundry about his suspicious calls with the topless dancer were revealed. Many people struggled to see John as anything other than a pillar of the community, and while they were quick to admit he overstepped his professional boundaries with the stripper, his supporters refused to believe he was capable of murder. In fact, the alleged mistress became a convenient scapegoat for many who didn't want to face the reality that the beloved doctor was a cold-blooded wife killer. Prosecutors accused John of losing his temper and killing Susan during an argument, leaving the house to perform a surgery and returning home afterward to discover the murder scene. The most convincing testimony came from a blood spatter expert, who explained how marks on John's shirt were indicative of a beating in progress rather than someone tending to a victim after an attack. And after deliberating for just 2 hours, the jury found John guilty of Susan's murder. He was sentenced to life without parole and remained behind bars after appealing his case multiple times. 2. David Anthony Burns. 19-year-old Courtney Coco was last seen alive at her family's home in Alexandria, Louisiana in October 2004. 3 days later, her remains were found in an abandoned building nearly 200 miles away in Winnie, Texas. Her cause of death was unclear due to the heavily decomposed state of her body, but the circumstances of the case were enough to rule the manner of death as a homicide. Courtney had no known ties to anyone in Winnie, and the handful of people who initially fell under law enforcement's radar were ultimately cleared of any involvement in the young woman's murder. Investigators hoped for a break in the case when they located Courtney's car in Houston, but the people in possession of the vehicle were also released without charges. DNA analysis of blood found in the trunk turned up as a match to Courtney, indicating that the killer had used her car to transport her dead body. But authorities were never able to figure out how the vehicle ended up in the possession of the people who were caught driving it. The case quickly became a whodunit, and over time detectives began to wonder if Courtney had been killed by a complete stranger. But in 2011, several witnesses came forward, claiming that David Anthony Burns, the former fiancé of Courtney's older sister Lace Evans, had confessed to smothering Courtney to death with a pillow. But there was no physical evidence linking him to the crime, and the investigation once again hit a standstill. Police finally arrested Burns in 2021, more than 16 years after the murder, following a renewed effort to solve the case and the discovery of a key witness who was able to place him at the scene where Courtney's body was dumped. According to prosecutors, Courtney was secretly seeing Burns romantically, even though he was engaged to her sister. On the night of her death, she was home alone watching her family's dogs while they were out of town. Courtney had recently received a large inheritance, and the crime scene showed signs of a burglary. And according to witnesses, Burns had admitted to having financial motives. But some people speculated that the murder was the product of more than just a burglary, and that something went terribly wrong between Courtney and Burns that night. While prosecutors never speculated that Burns was afraid Courtney would expose their affair, the very nature of their relationship makes it hard not to wonder if this was a factor. Burns maintained his innocence throughout his trial, but failed to sway the jury in his favor. And in the end, he was convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to life without parole. 1. George Stephen Birch. During what was supposed to be a fun night out with friends in Green Bay, Wisconsin in 2016, 31-year-old mother of three, Nicole Vander Heiden, got into a heated argument with her boyfriend and the father of her youngest child, 35-year-old Douglas Dentry. She left for another bar without Dentry and was still out when he arrived at the couple's home later that night. Dentry initially assumed that Nicole had spent the night at a friend's house, but when she failed to return home the next morning, he reported her missing. Immediately suspicious of Dentry, police questioned why he waited so long to report Nicole's disappearance. That same day, her body was found in a field just 3 miles from where the couple lived. Nicole's remains had been beaten and strangled to death in a manner so brutal that it shocked even the most seasoned detectives on the case. Meanwhile, the more detectives learned about Dentry's relationship with Nicole and the events leading up to her murder, the more convinced they became that Dentry was the killer. People who knew the couple described a relationship that seemed perfect at first. Over time, however, they began to have issues. In a recent text message to a friend, Dentry had mentioned that he was considering ending the relationship and asking Nicole and her kids to move out. And after storming off the night before, Nicole had sent Dentry a slew of text messages accusing him of being an abusive cheater. At one point, she tried calling him and he didn't pick up. But he answered the phone when Nicole called from a friend's phone, which only further fueled her anger. Nicole left the bar upset and was last seen walking down the streets into the darkness. Following the discovery of her body and several of her belongings that were found scattered throughout the area, police managed to obtain a male DNA profile from the evidence. Confident that Dentry would be a match, they arrested him and held him in custody while awaiting the results. But not only was Dentry not a match, items from his house that were initially taken as evidence ultimately proved to have no connection to Nicole's murder. His Fitbit data further showed that he only took 12 steps in the window of time during which the crime was committed, and as a result, Dentry was eliminated as a suspect and released from jail. The DNA implicated a 40-year-old man from Virginia named George Stephen Birch, who initially claimed that it hooked up with Nicole in his vehicle after giving her a ride home. He said it happened in her driveway, which sounded extremely unlike Nicole to anyone who knew her. She wasn't the type to cheat on her boyfriend or to have a casual encounter, and she was far out of Birch's league as far as looks went. Birch changed his story though when cell phone data put him in the scene where Nicole's body was dumped. He then claimed that Detry came outside and killed Nicole right in front of him after catching them in the act. Birch accused Detry of forcing him to dispose of Nicole's body at gunpoint and said he complied because he was afraid for his life. Prosecutors, however, claimed that Birch flew into a rage and murdered Nicole with his bare hands when she resisted his advances. He then dumped her body and threw her belongings out his car window as he drove away. George Stephen Birch was convicted of murder and was sentenced to life without parole. He continues to challenge his case from behind bars, hoping he'll eventually win back his freedom on a legal technicality or convince a court to believe his ridiculous version of events. Would you rather have a co-worker who's prone to throwing explosive tantrums, making you wonder how far their behavior will escalate in the future, or an eerily quiet and socially awkward co-worker who's never lost their temper in your presence but seems like they could snap at any moment? Let us know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. Thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you next time. Bye.